I'm not exactly sure how many people are still into superhero related video games, mainly because the 2010s was such a miserable decade, or at least the second half of the decade was miserable. In terms of popularity, it seems like for the first half of the decade, DC was more popular than Marvel and vice versa in terms of, I guess, both video games and in terms of like film and movies and stuff like that. And, during that decade, like one of the few good things to have emerged from the decade for the most part is, I guess, video games. I mean, there were some pretty good films that came out during the 2010s decade in relation to DC and Marvel. It's just that a lot of people have not paid attention to it because there's been a lot of issues with the economy and I guess just people being unhappy in general. And as far as superhero-related video games are concerned, there are quite a few that I can name off the top of my head. But in terms of which one was the best, I mean, I don't really know. It depends on how you look at it. If you look at it from a sales standpoint, a lot of people would go on record and tell you that Spider-Man for the PS4 back in 2018 was probably the best, considering how successful it was. In terms of commercial sales, I believe it managed to reach 33 million units worldwide, and that was probably the best-selling superhero-related video game of that decade. In terms of quality, a lot of people would put it on the same level as Batman Arkham City from 2011, which was something that a lot of people are also very fond of that game as well. And that was probably the best Batman game in the entire Arkham trilogy, which lasted from '09 to 2015, I believe. And then you got the two Injustice games from that came out in 2013, and then Injustice 2, which came out in 2017. Now, Injustice 2 was obviously a more successful game, and Injustice 1 was interesting in of itself because a lot of people really didn't expect a game where you had Superman and Wonder Woman as supervillains or anti-villains, because they've mainly been portrayed in a heroic light as it relates to the DC universe. And I would say that the storyline for Injustice was probably better than, I guess, Spider-Man for the PS4 and maybe the Batman Arkham games to some extent. But but Injustice 2 didn't sell nearly as much as Arkham City. I don't think it sold as much as Arkham City. It didn't sell nearly as much as Spider-Man for the PS4. And then you also have like high-profile fighting games like Marv vs. Capcom 3, which came out back in 2011. That was a game a lot of people enjoyed, but it didn't sell as much as other superhero-related video games. And but a lot of people bought it. I believe it broke over 1 million because the nostalgia and the anticipation for the game is what made a lot of people buy it, because Marvel vs. Capcom 2 had come out back in the year 2000, I believe, and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was... It felt completely different. Like the gameplay, the soundtrack, the character art, everything. And you have Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which is also a superhero-related game that came out back in 2017. And that game, I believe it was underwhelming. It wasn't a bad game, but at the same time, it wasn't as good as Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and it definitely could have been much better than what it was. But in terms of what's the best superhero-related game of the teens decade, that's something that that everybody has their own preference about, and it's something that's definitely subjective because it really depends on how you measure the success of a particular game. Some people look at it through sales, how many copies of the game sell worldwide. Some people look at the overall replay value of a particular game, and there are some people who are just fans of DC DC more so than Marvel and vice versa. But that's a question I don't think anybody can really answer. Even if I did a poll on it, I don't think anybody could really answer that. But if we're looking at things from a commercial standpoint, in terms of sales and all that stuff, a lot of people go on record and say that Spider-Man for the PS4 is probably the most mainstream, high-profile video game of the teens decade.